So in James chapter 4, now we talk a lot about verse 13 and 14, right? Talked about the uncertainty, how life is very short and how life is very uncertain. And we need to make sure we're living each day with the proper kind of mindset, making sure we're not leaving God out of the picture. And that part comes from verse 15, which says, instead, so come now, verse 13 says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. And whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Now, keeping God's will in our plans, in our wants, in our desires, that's what James is talking about. Yes? Does that make sense? All right? Now, in doing this, Jesus set the perfect example. Can you remember a time in Jesus' life that's recorded for us where he kind of said something like, I want to do this, but only if it's your will, God? Do you remember him saying something like that, and when he would have said it?
When he says, let this cup pass from me.
Okay, in the garden, Matthew 26, y'all remember Jesus was praying, and he did this 3 times, and he said, if this cup can pass from me, let it be so, but if not, your will be done. He's talking to God, he's praying to God, right? That your will be done. And that is the idea of, yes, I might have a desire, I might have a want, I might have a thing I want to do, but I always need to be keeping God's will for me and his ultimate will in mind, right? And so Jesus, it's not like we don't have an example for us to do that. Jesus set the example. Now, if we go back to verse 14, this idea that life is very short, it's just for a vapor, it appears for a little while and vanishes. This did not originate with Christianity. This is not a new idea. It didn't originate with Judaism. I think we could go along, we could pull out a book or a thing of writing, collection of writings from every culture, and we could find something like this, that life is very short. And we're here just for a moment. Because don't you think, if we just take it by itself, is that a religious saying? Do we need to have religion to figure that out? No, we don't. We don't need to have religion. It's just common sense, right? A few generations go on, and then we can look back and we can say, yeah, life's pretty short. Or just one generation, really. Life is short. Life is very uncertain. Really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, that kind of thing. So this is a common sense saying that the whole world knows about, but we often tend to ignore it. And why it's easy to say that we ignore it is because of the way we live and the way we see some people living. But what James does is he takes this very common saying that anybody who would have ever gotten a hold of James' writings, and I think he's writing to Hebrew Christians, Jewish Christians. Anybody who would have got a hold of James' writings, which they're all over the world now, they will see this, and what James does is put a Christian slant on it, I guess. And he adds God into the picture in verse number 15. And even religious people of James' day, let's say the Greeks in James' day. Now, did they worship, did they have their gods? They did. Did they think their gods had some kind of influence in their lives? Did they believe that? They did. All right. And so really when he says, well, if a Greek might say, well, if our gods will it, we got to make sure we're pleasing the gods. And so it's very similar, right? But James, when he puts, this is interesting. I think that when he says the Lord wills, now he even puts a more Christian slant on this idea that would have been very familiar to everybody. So he takes that belief, he takes this belief in verse 15, and he slaps on it, puts some religion on it. He puts a spiritual slant on it, and then he goes even further and he puts the Christian slant on it. Instead of saying God, which some Greek or something might have translated, well, yeah, a God, yeah, we have a God, a main God, a overseeing God. But then he puts the Lord. And so obviously I think he's talking about Jesus Christ there. So he places this saying squarely right onto Christianity. And so the message is, we ought not to be planning so hastily and so unwisely. And we need to be remembering that our lives are ultimately in the providential hands of God. And that is where, when we do that and we live that way, that is where this humility that James has been talking about since verse number 6 comes into the picture, where we need to be humble people. Sometimes we act like, why is that? Can someone close that door back there, if you don't mind? Sorry. If I were to say that some people act like we live in a closed system, what do you think that means?
Don't let outsiders in.
We don't let outsiders in. Now, we don't let outsiders in. Now think bigger on that. Expand bigger on that. So I'm going to tell you that some people live as if they live in a closed system.
Narrow-minded.
What's that?
Narrow-minded.
Okay. I can make that fit to the answer I'm looking for. Yes. Let me say this. Do religious people live sometimes like a God doesn't exist? Well, of course they do. So what I mean by a closed system is that they don't think God has any kind of control. They don't think God has any kind of influence. They don't think he's got any kind of providence whatsoever in the world, and they live that way. We put ourselves in this physical box, and of course our atheists and humanists do this, materialists do this. We live in this closed box where there's no outside supernatural force that could ever touch us. You can if you want to, yeah. But that's not the case. And all of us, I would say here, you might not have worded it like that, a closed system. But we know that that's not true. We don't live in a closed system because we know we have a God in heaven. Do y'all believe in a spiritual realm that kind of coexists alongside the physical realm? And I'm not talking about ghosts and stuff like that. What's that? We're told one's there, right? I mean, is God a physical being? I mean, he's spirit, right? John 4:24. So that must mean he lives in a spiritual place. Is heaven a physical place, or what does the Bible teach? Is heaven a spiritual place? Seems like it does teach that. And so there's got to be a spiritual realm when he talks about that verse in Hebrews chapter 1 where it says that angels are ministering spirits, sent forth to minister to those who are inherit eternal salvation or eternal life. I mean, how do you think that works? If that's not telling you that there's a spiritual realm alongside a physical realm, and I'm not pretending to know all the details about that particular verse, I think there's some things we can learn from it. But that tells us that there's a physical realm and a spiritual realm somehow coexisting alongside one another. And that's not a closed system that we live in. And so because we don't live like that, we don't live in a place like that, then we shouldn't act like we live in a place like that. As if God is not there, God is not seeing, and God is not watching, and God can't so providentially order things to accomplish his will. Right? And we take that all the way down to our own tiny little individual lives and then blow it up into the big picture. Does that make sense? Oh, so any comments? Anybody got a thought on that? None at all. Perfect. This saying, the Lord wills. Now, we usually don't say it exactly like that. What do we say? It's a tiny bit different. What do we say? Lord willing. And you might put a G on the end of that or not. I don't know. Maybe possibly. I had a friend tell me one time, he was, I don't know if it bothered him. It seemed like it bothered him. He was wondering why some people say that after almost everything they say. And he said, I don't know why we have to say that after everything we say we're going to do. And his thought was, that should be a given. It's something that shouldn't have to be said. It should be able to go unsaid, because of course our whole life should be centered around if the Lord wills, if it's God's will. And I thought, when he said that, I thought he was right. I thought he was right. Now I'm just curious about what y'all think about that. Yes, ma'am.
I would say that, I mean, this not necessarily being literal, but it's of that mindset. Like, we don't have to physically say it all the time, but we have that mindset of, like, you know.
It's the same as pray without ceasing.
Pray without ceasing.
I mean, you're not-
Literally?
Right, you're not gonna.
Because I haven't done it in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay. It's a mindset, right? And I would agree. It's like this principle we live by. It's just like, that's part of our worldview. That's how we think. Every decision I make, of course I'm thinking about Christ. Of course I'm thinking about maybe some Bible verses and what the scripture would say. Of course I'm thinking, is this going to be pleasing to God or not, you know? That's a given. Now, sometimes I will say it. I've said it to you. I write it in my emails, you know, because I kind of want to make a point. I want to when I write it in my emails, Lord willing, we'll see each other Sunday. Well, I kind of want to make a point to let you know what I'm thinking and get you to just be mindful of, verses like chapter 4 of James 13 and 14. And so, if we're not careful, this phrase, first let me say, this is not commanded to say, Lord willing, after everything we say, that every plan we make and everything we're going to do. That's not a command. And we need to be careful, because sometimes the sayings like this will turn into like a good luck charm. Or people will just say it very flippantly and it doesn't really mean anything. It's just they've just gotten used to saying it. Now, I've said this phrase right here, I've said it before, and I've heard other people say it, and I've never thought, oh, he or she doesn't really mean that. Never really thought that. But I'm just going to give you an example of how it could possibly come. We insert this into our everyday language where it doesn't really mean anything. It's just what we say. If the good Lord's willing and the... Okay. So at least one of you has heard that before. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be saying that. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just saying, be careful that doesn't turn into something you don't even know. You just say it because Grandmama said it. I grew up here and I just say it. Sometimes Paul would use the phrase, he would use this often. I'm going to give you one example. It's in Acts chapter 18. So it's not wrong to say, Lord willing, we're going to do this thing. Obviously, we want to have I think James is more talking about the mindset, like I said, and some of y'all said. Look at verse 21 of Acts 18. He says, but he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, Paul saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. But I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. Okay, so, but he didn't say that about everything that he did. There was a time in chapter 15 of Romans where he talks about going to Spain. He didn't say it there. He says, Romans 15:23. He says, verse 22 says, he's been hindered from coming to see him. It says, but now no longer having a place in these parts and having a great desire these many years to come to you. Whenever I journey to Spain, I shall come to you, Lord willing. Nope, they don't say that. But don't you think Paul was thinking that? Of course he was. And then he says, for I hope to see you on my journey, Lord willing. Nope. And to be helped on my way there by you, Lord willing. If first I may enjoy your company for a while, Lord willing. But I'm going to Jerusalem to minister, saying, Lord willing. They don't say any of that. So I think there's a time for it. And then you don't have to, I think if you live with that mindset, that's what James is talking about. And I think, and I'm not saying people are overdoing it. Don't get me wrong with that. I want us to be always in the right mindset and never take something that's biblical and turn it into this. Well, if I say this many times, if I say it after I do this thing, then God's got to do it because I just invoke the name of the Lord. Well, that's not a thing. That's not a biblical thing. Hey.
I agree with you on the mindset thing. I think it's also goes back to verse 6 there where it says he gives grace to the humble. It's kind of saying, you're not going to do it without God. If God wills it, it's going to happen. But you yourself are not just going to say, oh, we're going here to make this profit and do this and that. It's not going to happen. It's not. So it's kind of just a humbling thing to say, hey, this might happen as long as it's in the cards.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Not to be boastful,
whenever you put God in the picture, in the plan, you are showing humility because you're saying God is over you, basically. It's up to, your hands are in God's hands, that kind of thing. And I know Calvinists, we can take that way too far than we need to.
You're not going to do it on your own.
Right. Yeah, nothing we've done here so far in the past week or so is on our own. There's no way that could have happened because God has blessed us with a number of things that started before all of the material blessings. That's why we've been able to do what we've been able to do. And so it's not enough. Let me say it. Let's just repeat it one more time. Make sure the horse is dead. It's not enough to just speak this out loud. Lord willing, if the creek don't rise and do. We don't just speak that out aloud. That's not enough. It has to be this principle, this truth ingrained within our minds that we live our lives by and we make our decisions by. And that's what he's talking about. Did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
I think oftentimes, Chuck, I confuse I haven't looked up the verb tenses or anything, but I tend to, in my life, confuse what James is saying here with the word will or wills, depending on translation. That's kind of a present tense. And willing is a future tense. And so, I confuse that in my life sometimes. I forget that even the very step and the very breath that I take today is what God wills. And so,
sure, yeah, it's a blessing from God, right? Yeah. And then I wanted to talk about this too. Do you think, and we want to be careful not to take this principle, this expression too far either. As if, let's say, someone would just live so carelessly and just make all these haphazard decisions, thinking that, well, God's just gonna work it out in the end, isn't it? No matter what happens. I mean, no matter my decision, I didn't really think this thing through. And, well, God's got my back because God, Lord willing, and this kind of thing. Lord willing, we'll just do this thing on this decision. Can you see how that might get us get a person in trouble? I mean, God does expect us to do something as far as thinking and making wise and, cautious, being cautious and thinking things out. And it's not wrong to plan things and make the decisions. And then seek his guidance and that kind of thing. I mean, Romans 8:28, it says, all things work together. I think that's another phrase here. All things work together for good, those who love God. Well, I love God and I obey his commandments. I'm a faithful Christian. And that means I'm just going to do this thing and live this way and make these decisions for me and for, for whoever's, my family and my friends and my neighbors and, whatever. It's just going to work out. I mean, I think we can take that a little too far. And so we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. We are still expected by our God. He gave us a brain so we can make these rational, smart, wise decisions with the directions of our lives, not leaving him out of the picture, of course. What do you think? You like it? All right. Now, why I don't believe James is addressing Christians in the congregation here. Now, I kind of brought this up last time, didn't really get into it. When in verse 13, where he says, come now, you Christians who say, I don't know, I'm not so sold that he's talking to Christians. I think he's giving an example of non-Christians who they would have been familiar with. Verse 13 sounds like these people got money. And from other chapters of the book, doesn't seem like these are just wealthy Christians. Now, I could be wrong about that, but let's just say that this part is not really referring to Christians. How would this help them then? Well, one, they're not going to repeat the mistake of these merchants, we would say, merchants of verse 13. They're not going to repeat their mistakes, these landowners or businessmen or whoever they are. All right, and then two, James wants these congregations, the church, these Christians, to be teaching this to the group that they would have been always in contact with. These business owners, these landowners, we know they've got contact with rich people because of chapter 1 and chapter 2. Trying to teach them the truth about how they live their lives and hopefully convert them to Jesus Christ. Okay. And verse 16 says, but now you boast in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. So that goes exactly against arrogance, goes exactly against the humility that he's talking about. Now, what about verse 17? It says, therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now, this might bring to mind the parable of the Good Samaritan. Do we all remember the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10? We had a man who fell by the wayside. And he was hurt and he needed help. And then along comes a priest. And he passes him by. Do you think the priest saw the man and thought, it would be good if I helped him? But I don't want to, for whatever reason. Whatever reason he didn't. He had to tell himself, I'm not going to do this thing that I know is good to do. Okay? And there he goes. And then who comes next? The Levite comes next. And he sees him. The man fell by the wayside. Guy's hurt. His neighbor passes him by. He knew he needed to do good, but he didn't do it. Well, did he sin?
Yes.
Okay. And then of course the Samaritan comes by and helps him out. 2 of the 3 failed to keep the royal law. The royal law, which is what? What did James call the royal law? Y'all remember? That was a whole 2 chapters ago now, so I know it's been a while. Huh?
Love thy neighbor.
Yes. Yep. Chapter 2 and verse 8. Love you. They failed to keep the royal law. To him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. If I know that it is good to do something for my neighbor when the opportunity presents itself and I don't do it, what is James saying that I'm also doing? Does that sound harsh, or are we right? Are we getting this right, or are we just overlooking it, or looking too much into it, or what? I mean, isn't that what it says?
That's what it's all about, being a servant.
Yeah. Well, that ought to prick a lot of us in the heart, I think. Then, shouldn't it? And again, James is teaching Jesus Christ here. He's been doing it the whole book. And he's been teaching Jesus. Now, and actually, James has already talked about this in verse 15 of chapter 2. He says, if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not do good to them, you don't give them the things which are needed, what does it profit? Oh, it doesn't profit anything. So he's already kind of given his own illustration of this. But if we were to go to Matthew 25, and Jesus is preaching about the judgment scene, and y'all have heard this 1,000 times probably, and he says, chapter 25, verse 42, I was hungry, you gave me no food, thirsty, no drink, stranger, you did not take me in, naked, you did not clothe me, sick in prison, you didn't visit me. And of course, they're saying, oh, we didn't do that to you, Jesus. And he says, well, when you didn't do it to my brethren, you were actually doing it to me. And so do we need a religious command to, when we see somebody who is in need, who needs clothing and food, do we have to look in the Bible for a command to know that that's good to help them?
Compassion.
Great day. And don't you think isn't that part of who we are? Like when we come into this world? I think it is. I think we come into this world with a set of God-given morals that we start to figure out as we get older. Like, why does, like my boys would pick flowers for, when they were little, they picked flowers for mom. I didn't tell them to do that. I mean, I'm kind of admitting something, but I told them to do nice things for their mom. But they just pick flowers and do something nice for her. Well, where did they learn that from? Must be all that sin they were born in with. Huh? Why didn't teach them to do that? I think there's something, there is that kind of compassion and love that is ingrained with each and every one of us. And we don't really need a law to do it, but we are, obviously I'm thankful that Jesus taught on it, because we got a problem forgetting that we're made in God's image and we go off on our own thing. There's another teaching of Jesus that this is reminding us of in Luke chapter 12 and verse 47. He says, and that servant who knew his master's will, which we have to assume that's if it was good, and did not prepare himself to do according to his will, he shall be beaten with many stripes. And then James says, to him who knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him is sin. What do you think if I were to say verse 17 is one of the most ignored passages in all the truths in all of Scripture?
Truth.
I think it's pretty up there, I'd say, at least. You know, one of the favorite sayings I've heard in the past 4 years or so, and COVID hit, and then all this crazy stuff in the news, like people, it's just the culture war, I guess, that's going on, and politics are in it as well. And a lot of people are saying something like, the reason why we're in this is because good men do nothing. There's this famous quote that says something like, the way to let evil triumph is is when good men do nothing. Y'all have heard something similar to that in the past 4 years? And most of Christians and those on the conservative side of things are like, yeah, that's right. And we'll bust out, break out the t-shirts and like, yeah, cool saying or whatever. And, but then when it comes to their faith, they just like, it doesn't even apply to the faith. Well, there's probably something wrong with that. There's something wrong with that. What would we call these sins in verse 17? There's a certain word. If you know to do something good and you don't do it, that's a sin of what? Sin of omission. Now let me keep this, trying to bring this back in the context of the chapter. So in verse 13, whoever the subjects are, could be non-Christians, could be Christians, I don't think it really matters. They are but we know that we're not, what those subjects in 13, what they're not doing is taking God's will into account of their plans. And he's saying that's sin. And so James is giving this example, 13 and 14, maybe 15 and 16. And he's teaching these Christians that he's writing to that, and you know what, in a similar way as these merchants and these people are doing this thing, and they're sinning, you, Christians, are not taking God's will into account when you're treating each other the way you've been treating each other, going back up to verse number 1, where he says, where are all these warring and fighting coming from among you? It's your selfishness, it's your pride. You're not taking into account God's will when you treat each other like that, and that's sinful. And that's why he's bringing this up. You know you got to treat each other. You know you're supposed to use your tongue, chapter 3, in a proper way. To anybody, especially to each other. You know what you need to be mindful of, how you pray to God and what you pray for. And make sure that your selfishness is not in there. But you're doing it anyways. And he's saying you're sinning. And so back to this sin of omission thing. You're not, and I don't think we should, no one is to be blamed for this. It's just now, if we're always thinking about what sin, this particular way, this is what sin is, then now is the time to change your thinking on it. We might get wrapped up into thinking, well, as long as I don't do the bad thing, because that's sin. As long as I stay away from whatever, XYZ sin that's listed in the Bible, I'm good to go. But we need to be reminded, and this verse reminds us that we are not considered faithful in God's eyes simply by refraining from sin only. When God says, I want you to do this thing, to do positive and this good thing, and I don't do that good thing, Scripture says it's sin. And so I just can't sit on my hands as a Christian my whole life. And as long as I don't put beer in my mouth, or as long as I don't, curse somebody out, or as long as I don't cheat on my wife, I'm going to go to heaven. Well, there's a whole lot more to a faithful Christian life than that. Because you have to do what God wants us to do. We getting it?
In my life, I struggle with that passage. Everyone knows my sister. And I do all I can. And I'm sure there's people out there in the community that says, well, why don't her family help her? Why can't they help her more? you know, we do help her as much as we can, but she doesn't want to improve her life.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I feel like, you know, I should be doing more, but, and I want to be a better Christian and do more, but I feel like she's not willing to help herself.
yeah. So look, I know, I've talked to you and Robin about this before. The fact that you even feeling that way tells me, at least, forget everybody else right now, tells me that your heart's in the right place. You're always gonna have some people who are gonna say, well, they're not doing enough. They're not doing enough. That's the kind of judging that some Christians gripe about, that think that's happening to them when it's not. That kind of judging is the wrong kind of judging because they don't know. They don't have all the facts. They're not in your home. They're not in the conversations with you and Karen and you know, they don't know what you've done. All they can see is on the outside, well, where's her family at? Well, how do they don't know that they've been there. And I know
also
this is,
think about, what does God think? Does God think I should be doing more as a Christian?
well,
You know, I don't. You know, I don't want to go to hell because I've not been doing enough, you know,
yeah.
to help.
I want you to trust. You know whether you have been doing enough. You know. And maybe, and I think deep down you know that you've been doing enough. And what you need, I want you to pray that God sees that. If there's something more you could do, you would do it. But God does not expect us, even for family, to be doormats and for people and to be abused by people who do not want what's good for them. You can be there for her whole life, and say, when you're ready, we've got open arms for you. And to me, that's far more than other people in your situation would ever do for their loved ones who are in her position.
It's like the prodigal son. His father didn't go out and pull him out of that pigsty. He had to want to get out of the pigsty.
And when the son came home, there was the father running to greet him. You know, me and you and everybody else are never going to be good enough. The only way we're going to be saved is because of how good God is. Please don't, and anyone else who's might be in a similar situation, don't beat yourself up thinking that you haven't done everything that you could. And maybe there is something, maybe you deep down, you're like, maybe I can try this one more thing or whatever, I don't know. But if you're helping someone in a bad situation is going to end up dragging you down with them as well, or hurting them, or hurting your family, or hurting something, or hurting your faith. There is a line we have to draw, and I know because a family is so hard to draw that line, you know, because you love them and you want to see them in heaven as well, and you think there's always this little ray of hope, you know, that you're going to come around. From what I know, if this means anything, from what I know, y'all are doing what's right. I think you're doing what's right. And in my human opinion, I think God also knows you're doing what's right. Thanks for sharing that. All right. We'll do our questions next week. You better have them filled out, folks. You better have them filled out. All right. Uh-oh.